Welcome to this Tutor to You Sociology topic video on global development, looking at feminism and development. Feminist views of development focus on the ways in which women are disadvantaged in all walks of life on a global scale. Whilst progress has been made in more economically developed countries in the 20th century, many women were excluded from the considerations of development policy until later in the 20th century. Feminists such as Diana Leonard suggest that this places women in the developing world in a far more disadvantaged position than their Western counterparts. Gloria Steinem even suggested that women in the developing world form a fifth world, using the now outdated description of first world being the West, second world being communist nations, third world being the developing world, and further disadvantage being placed upon social class, rural locations, and gender. Quite simply, Steinem argued that women in the developing world were at the very bottom of the social hierarchy, in an early explanation of intersectionality. In the developing world, women face many barriers to equality, including many things that are taken for granted in the Western world, such as access to education, reproductive rights, the ability to gain employment and own property, and also the risk of trafficking and war crimes. In this video, we're going to look at some of the different perspectives put forward by feminists that explain this disadvantaged position. There are different perspectives that different types of feminists take on the issue of gender in the developing world. Marxist feminists focus on the exploitation of women that comes with the introduction of capitalist production and the role of TNCs in the developing world, focusing on women's employment, what is commonly referred to as the exploitation thesis. Other feminists focus on how women are marginalised in the developing world through limited opportunities to education, employment, property ownership and political participation, what is called the marginalisation thesis. Finally, we'll look briefly at post-structural or postmodern feminist approaches that focus on the dangers brought about by globalisation for women and how a woman's life in the developing world is markedly different from that in the Western world. Firstly, the exploitation thesis, a Marxist feminist approach that looks at how the imposition of capitalism onto developing societies has led to the exploitation of women's labour. With the growth of free trade movements and the imposition of structural adjustment policies as a result of aid given by IGOs, much employment in the developing world has been taken over by TNCs, who are able to relocate to the developing world and set up export processing zones. These are areas of a nation that are set up to mass-produce goods for transnational corporations and pay lower wages than in the West and often are able to circumvent labour laws and regulations. Simply put, they are cheap labour for big companies, where employees have few rights and work long hours. 90% of the workers in these areas are young women, and Marxist feminists suggest that young women specifically are targeted for employment as they are seen as cheap, pliable and docile, often taking on the work as it is their only viable route out of poverty. Their labour is undervalued and contributes towards TNCs making more profit than if they employed workers in the West. Leonard argues that TNCs aim to exploit the labour of these young women through low pay, long hours and poor working conditions, rather than providing sustainable opportunities for women in the developing world. The counter-argument to this is that the formal employment is more stable than living off informal employment in agriculture, and that it aids, particularly young women, to escape from patriarchal control of child marriage and provides them with an opportunity to become financially independent. However, Foster Carter argues that these jobs require young women, often in their early teenage years, to move to urban areas and away from their families, and that this leads to further risk of exploitation, with many young girls forced into prostitution and crime when inevitably TNCs move on to a lower wage economy. In contrast, the marginalisation thesis looks at how women in the developing world have become marginalised and how developmental policy and the imposition of traditional Western values influenced women's role in society. Abbott and Wallace suggest that colonial powers imposed traditional values about men and women, and that Western notions of femininity were imposed upon developing nations and deemed them to be deviant. Whilst this imposition of Western ideas rid the developing world of traditional practices such as suti, the burning of wives after their husbands had died, it also created the ideas that males laboured and women stayed at home. Men were employed as paid labourers in many aid projects, and this left men leaving their families and women were left to tend to smaller agricultural plots. The money males earned was not passed on to the family and was instead their money, rather than a more collective approach that existed in traditional societies. A further criticism is that aid is not gender neutral. Initially, aid workers in the 1960s and 70s would bring their patriarchal views about women and their role in employment or their ability to deal with technology. Males were trained to operate machinery, giving them an advantage. This has changed in recent decades, but initial development assistance largely excluded women. Finally, postmodern feminist views. There has been a criticism of many feminist approaches for portraying women in the developing world as unsophisticated, poor, uneducated, and bound by traditions. However, critics would argue that this is a form of cultural imperialism, and that many women in the developing world look for the same freedoms as Western women have. A further consideration of postmodern feminism is the impacts of globalization on women's lives, with the growth of women and girls being trafficked into forced sexual activity increasing to nearly 5 million a year according to recent UN estimates. This is a result of limited employment opportunities, forced migration from conflict, and patriarchal control over women, often from organised gangs, and a real threat to women in the developing world. That concludes this Tutor to You Sociology topic video on global development, looking at feminist views of gender. Thanks for watching.